Hello, welcome to the debate. I'm Kabatahwe. Venezuela's free and fair parliamentary elections have been held. The Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro's governing Socialist Party has regained control of the National Assembly and is now called to chart a path towards national reconciliation, amongst other things. Now, major opposition groups, including the one led by the U.S.-backed opposition leader Juan Guaido, boycotted the vote, calling it a fraud. In this debate, we will look at why the West, particularly the EU and the U.S., have not called this a free and fair election, while backing the self-proclaimed president and opposition leader Juan Guaido. Joining us for this debate is Professor of International Studies at Unmasking, Bruno Lima Rocha, who joins us from Porto Alegre in Brazil. We also have activist and political commentator Ramiro Funes, who joins us from Los Angeles. I'd like to welcome you both. Ramiro Funes, let me first start with you. Looking at the parliamentary elections, the Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, the governing Socialist Party, has regained control of the National Assembly. What does this mean for Venezuela, and what message does this send?
Thank you for having me on. The fact that President Nicolas Maduro and the United Socialist Party of Venezuela have won the legislative branch of Venezuela's government means that there will be less deadlock. Let's not forget that for the past few years, the National Assembly has been directly operated not just by the Venezuelan opposition, but has been directly taking orders from the U.S. government, USAID, NGOs that are intended to destabilize Venezuela, privatize its oil. And so all efforts for the past few years, what we've seen from the National Assembly is attempts to deadlock any sort of progress made by the socialist government of Venezuela. This means that it makes it harder for the PSUV to bring food to working class people, to provide jobs, to elevate and construct the economy, which has from day one been the goal. Now that the National Assembly, the opposition, has been relegated to a more minor role, and that the Chavistas in power can actually do the things that they've been wanting to do, I think what we're going to see is that we're going to see more construction, more progress in Venezuela. We're going to see more public services. We're going to see less attempts by the opposition to destabilize, and I think that's really important to keep in mind.
Okay, well, Bruno, why don't you tell us why the West, EU and the U.S., have described these elections as not being free and fair?
Well, first of all, they accuse Maduro's administration to not allowing for international observers to go forward and look what was going on in Venezuela. But I can understand this measure because Venezuela is under attack since so long time that they have to do their countermeasures against the coup d'etat, for example, that they suffered last year. So they are alleging that the Venezuela election is not fair, but it's I would say it's hypocritical because in 2013, the Carter Center said that Maduros was elected in a fair election, and the State Department said that Capriles was stolen. So whatever they do in Venezuela, the West, the UN, or at least the USA and the EU, they will say that they're not fair. I think that their goal is to destabilize Venezuela and not allowing Venezuela to do to convert their oil revenues in some kind of industrialization, and first of all, to be sovereign in food production, because unhappily, the state of Venezuela do not produce the whole food they need. This is a lack of Maduro's economy. This was a lack in Chavez's economy, and they must overcome this and be sovereign in food production.
Well, Ramiro Funes, the U.S. has obviously not acknowledged, nor confirmed, nor accept the results of these elections. As a matter of fact, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that these elections were a, quote, political farce, which he said the U.S. condemns as a charade. Of course, the first question that comes to mind is how can he say this when the U.S. presidential elections themselves have been called by some a charade?
That's exactly right. I mean, you compare the elections in Venezuela. First of all, let's acknowledge the fact that there have been more elections in Venezuela under the Bolivarian Revolution, which began in 1999 with the election of Hugo Chavez. There have been over 15 elections, countless, way more than the United States, and these are direct democratic elections. Venezuela is a democratic, direct republic. the United States is a representative republic, which is very different. In the United States, the people, what it really comes down to is the Electoral College. And we saw that play out in the battle between Trump and Biden, where the people don't really exercise political power. You have the marginalization of black and brown communities, of voters. In Venezuela, black, brown, and indigenous people are given the power to vote. They're mobilized to vote. They're given the day off, first of all. And so what we see in Venezuela is more democracy. For the U.S. to go and claim that these elections were a sham is just ridiculous. And we really have to look at history to understand why this is nonsense. I mean, for example, you have the fact that in 1973, after the overthrow of Salvador Allende in Chile, who was a leftist president, they implemented Pinochet as a government. They had a farce election which nobody participated in, and they called those democratic. The same thing in 2009 with the U.S.-backed coup against Honduran President Manuel Zelaya. The military removed him from power. They had a sham election and imposed a right-wing military regime that still reigns. And in Bolivia, just last year, we saw that President Evo Morales, the first indigenous president, was removed from power for completely farcical reasons. The military, again, had a farcical election. The U.S. approved it, even though nobody participated. And the same thing. So we really have to keep this all with a grain of salt. One last thing on this point that I just want to mention is that the U.S., no matter what, it knows that these claims of election fraud are total nonsense. But the point is to stir trouble by any means. What the U.S. wants, just like in other countries, in Iran, in Russia, and China, in Venezuela, Nicaragua, what they want is destabilization. They want a lack of trust in the political system of that country to spur protests by any means. But the people of Venezuela do not want protests. They do not want uprisings. They want peace, stability, and prosperity.
Well, Bruno, if we want to take a look at perhaps the incoming U.S. administration headed by the President-elect Joe Biden, if confirmed or once confirmed, don't you think that it has lost some footing when you have the current president who doesn't accept the election results in the U.S., and yet you have the incoming president come to the table and then say, maybe, again, I'm asking your opinion here, what will it say, or what will the president-elect say, or whoever he chooses to perhaps head any type of negotiations with Venezuela, and in particular Maduro?
Maybe. I would say that for us in Latin America, the Democrats are as bad as Republicans. I would quote, for example, Lyndon Johnson was vice president of John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was murdered, assassinated, and then they killed the one who killed John Kennedy, and they said that Brazil was under a communist threat and auxiliated the coup d'etat in Brazil in 1964. So from here, from Latin America, we can expect everything from the gringos, everything from the worst part of the gringos they come and they send to us. But I would say that Joe Biden maybe do some steps. For example, suspend some parts of the blockade, or at last allow Citgo to do operations in U.S. Citgo is one of the almost a dozen PDVSA subsidiaries who are under blockade also, and who are under a kind of, I would say, white list for prohibiting. Maybe, for example, if they suspend partially the blockade of Iran, Iran may produce more oil together with Venezuela. The last thing that Venezuela would need now would be an escalation in the blockade, and an escalation to destabilize Venezuela. But I don't think so. I think that Joe Biden would be so-called multilateralist and so-called through the UN, and would not do a direct provocation against Venezuela. He may do this, but I don't know if for the first 6 months he will do some steps, just like Mike Pompeo administration.
We need to discuss this a little bit further, since so much of the U.S. pressure on Venezuela has been exercised from Europeans in so many different ways. But of course, all eyes would be, again, once and if President-elect Biden gets confirmed, what type of approach he's going to have. One of the headlines that caught our attention here that I'm going to ask you if you think this will be the case is that Biden will herald a shift in U.S. strategy towards Venezuela. And it goes on to say that Biden now has a historic opportunity to lead an international coalition to promote a political solution for Venezuela. This coming from Juan Gonzalez, who advised Biden on Latin American issues. Now, do you think that that will be the case, or will we still see that maximum pressure being exercised on Maduro and Venezuela?
That's a great question. I mean, I think no matter what, the maximum pressure has been and will continue to be imposed against Venezuela since 1999 when Chavez was elected. But it takes different forms. I think what we saw for the past 3 years, I mean, last year and the year before that, we saw a failed coup attempt in Venezuela where they tried to support these uprisings. We saw a more hard-fist approach at the border as well with Colombia, where they tried to foment crisis and protests. And at one point, Trump was even threatening military escalation. And that is what the Trump and Republican and the Pentagon wing of the US ruling class represents. They represent hard power. They want guns, they want ships, they want weapons to be sent directly. You know, we even had the mercenary attack last year where US mercenaries were directly involved in trying to overthrow the Venezuelan government. I think what we're going to see is a shift over to the typical Democratic Party style of overthrowing color revolutions, quote unquote, peaceful pro-democracy protests. And we saw this happen time and time again under the Obama administration. For example, under Obama, it was revealed that the US government was funding right-wing underground radio stations that are, quote, pro-democracy in Cuba. We saw the Obama administration support a color revolution in Iran, the quote-unquote green revolution. They're going to continue this method because now the jig is up. People know that the United States for the past few years have been trying to go in and invade Venezuela directly, and they haven't been able to. And so now the US ruling class is like, look, we need to figure out a better strategy to win a better PR for this regime change. The maximum pressure will continue, but it will now continue in the form of funding NGOs, trying to use soft power to control the Venezuelan people against developing a socialist economy.
Bruno, when we take a look at the U.S. and how it has gathered countries in Latin America to rally against Maduro, we could name other countries also. One of the ways that this has been done is the U.S. influence on the Organization of American States. Is that strategy going to still continue? Do you think under Biden, or right now, we're looking again at the U.S. power image that it had prior to have faded with the way that Trump handled things in general, and the standing that the U.S. has had has actually decreased? Do you think then perhaps Latin American countries, given this impression of the U.S., may have a different view on Maduro, the ones who are against him?
I think, as I said before, maybe because the OEA, they had a ridiculous representation in the Bolivia crisis, and it was a so-called Frente Amplista from Uruguay who said that was a fraud in Bolivian election in 2019. And now Venezuela, they do have a chance to do another, I would say, era of alliance. First of all, with Bolivia and Cuba, their strategic allies. And then with more moderate relations, I would say, with Mexico and Argentina. So the OEA may not have a huge role to do in our continent, and we will feel this. For example, in the next Honduran election, when the State Department will be the first step to say that it was clean or not, because Honduran, they have 2 frauds consecutives, and first a coup d'etat. The coup d'etat, as a colleague said, it was a goal for Hillary Clinton administration in the State Department. They also did, under the Democratic Party, a coup d'etat in 2012 in Paraguay and a coup d'etat here in Brazil. So I think that this momentum, this first 6 months, will be for the new administration of U.S. to observe the continent and to, I would say, realize what will be their policy. Bad news, they do have a Gusano in the State Department, which is bad, so bad.
Well, one thing that it needs to do, let's talk about the challenges that really lie for Maduro now that he has won the parliamentary elections, his party that is. And Ramiro, tell us, one of the biggest challenges that I see immediately is the fact that there needs to be legitimacy on Maduro himself. I mean, at this point, we're looking at 60 countries not recognizing him, but recognizing Guaido as the leader. And we can add actually the EU also, because we haven't mentioned how the EU, seems like the EU is very fixated on Venezuela. They have come out and said that these elections, just like the US, are not free and fair. How can Maduro move forward to get his legitimacy in the first place, and then move to try to fix some of the broken institutions, mainly economic ones, in order to push Venezuela forward?
I think Maduro, President Nicolas Maduro, is in a very tough situation because he has, as you mentioned, both divisions at home and abroad. For all transparency, I do support President Nicolas Maduro. I have some critiques, of his administration, but overall, I think he's doing a pretty decent job at continuing the legacy of Hugo Chavez. However, one of the main issues in this election was a growing division between the Communist Party of Venezuela and the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, which is Maduro's party. There were actually some Communist Party members of Venezuela that were boycotting the PSUV, that were going against. And so one of the reasons for that is that many people in Venezuela feel that some of the socialist reforms are not being implemented fast enough. Now, here's the thing. The only way to implement socialist reforms is by building and developing the country. Socialism has to be built on abundance. And as I mentioned earlier, for the past 2 or 3 years, the National Assembly has made it almost impossible for the Venezuelan government to develop its economy. Thankfully, because of countries like Iran, like China, like Russia, and others, it's been able to lift more people out of poverty, but that's been very difficult to do. And so I think domestically, one way that Maduro can really unite, close ranks and unite the Venezuelan people is to accelerate those socialist reform programs, nationalize more industries, bring more wealth and prosperity to the broad masses of people. Now, internationally, that's a different question. When we're talking about the European Union, the United States, no matter what, and it's not about Maduro, it's about the fact that it's a government by and for the people that uses the profits of its oil for its own people. Even if it wasn't Maduro, if it was someone else, if he talked more politely, if he dressed better, they would still attack him with the same stuff, because at the end of the day, he's hurting the profits. He's hurting the profits of the big oil companies that run the European Union, that run the United States. So no matter what, I think we're going to continue to get these same messages from the EU, from the United States. But at the end of the day, that also is becoming a little less relevant, because now you have the rise of countries across, especially the Eurasian continent, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkey, Iran, so many countries that are developing and creating a new multilateral world order where you don't have to rely on the US and the EU anymore for their approval, because we can trade with Iran, we can trade with Kazakhstan, we can trade with China, and they're not going to try to tell us how to run our political system. And so I think while Maduro should definitely make efforts to close ranks at home, to re-radicalize the base around the Bolivarian project, I think no matter what, the EU and the US are going to keep talking against Maduro, but it's kind of irrelevant at this point.
Yes, but there is relevancy, and my final question goes to you, Bruno, that you need this country to be able to generate the income, and its number one commodity is oil. You have the U.S. that has been fixated on Venezuela, many say because of the oil. Do you think that there will be a chance that sanctions will allow, to be lifted, will allow Venezuela to generate income and then for the country to move forward? How do you see that future? If you can answer that in a minute.
Okay, that's the goal. That's the strategical goal. Venezuela has so many problems in economics. They have a problem in the smuggling economy. They have maybe 4 to 5 currencies inside the territory, and they must not be so dependent in oil trade. If there's sanctions, if the blockade is not relieved, I would say that they must do a kind of strategic alliance with Eurasian power, as the colleague said. Otherwise, the people will be starving, and they won't produce the abundance that they do need to socialize profits and products. Unhappily, that's a reality. They need oil, and oil is a curse. If you only have oil, oil is a curse.
Thank you for that. Let me thank our guest, Professor of International Studies at Unicinos, Bruno Lima Rocha, there talking to us from Porto Alegre, Brazil. Also activist and political commentator Ramiro Funes, who spoke to us from Los Angeles. That does it for this edition of The Debate. From Miko Atahwe, entire team here in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye until next time.